And I'm just thrilled to have this session. We published Mike's book, Unraveling, an Autoethnography of Suicide and Renewal, and it was just a fabulous experience working with him and reading his book, which he will tell you about. It was just an amazing piece of work, and we're so happy to have it in the series. And I want to thank Alec, who is just always there when you need him, anything you need him to do. And I really do so much appreciate that, Alec.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thanks, Mike. It's a
I'll
great
turn it
privilege
over
and
to you.
pleasure. Well, it's a great privilege and pleasure. I think we're going to start off. Mike, you're going to read your Why I Write poem from the book.
Sure. So just to provide some context, so I'm going to read a very short found poetry that you can find in the introduction of Unraveling. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you to, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but thank you to all the people who make this gathering possible. And thank you all to the audience members who could be here at this moment. That really means a lot to me. And as Carolyn noted, this book was quite it's a joy to put together, and it's a joy. I am thrilled that it's a part of the Writing Live series, and I am thrilled to be speaking about it with you all here. So to start the event, as Alec noted, I'm going to write a found poem that you can find in the introduction of Unraveling, and it's titled Why I Write. To provide some context, this was inspired by Terry Tempest Williams' essay of the same title, wherein each sentence began with the words "I write." And this is an exercise that I used in the past with my memoir students when I was a creative writing MFA student myself. And it's an exercise that I now use with my autoethnography students. And I wrote this found poem for three reasons. First, it addresses why I wrote the book specifically and why I write generally. It also honors those who came before me in a more gripping and creative way than a standard literature review, and I can speak some more about that after I read the poem. And it's a found poem that merges my words with that of autoethnographers. So in the book, there are in-text citations, but I'm not going to read those out loud. You can find them when you read that part of the book. And this poem also synthesizes my creative and scholarly sensibilities, which the Academy typically drives a wedge between. And with that said, I'll begin. Why I write. I write to plunge myself into depths and resurface anew. I write to exhale bated breaths. I write to feel nourished, to take that first sip of water after a deep thirst. I write to fill the looming silence with ink blots of grief. I write to create stories that resist and demand to be told. I write to turn calamities into gifts. I write to turn disease into unease. I write to expose the breaks and cracks of our existence. I write to cope with contradiction without obliteration. I write to arrest the legacy of shame that I have inherited. I write to find beauty in my raised and discolored scars, where before I saw only ugliness. I write to make the strange more humane, tolerable, and meaningful. I write to break myself open to intense pain in order to feel intense joy. I write as a way of grasping the world with my fingers. I write to stop the bleeding. I write instead of bleeding. I write to define myself and lose myself and find myself again. I write to imagine a future where I do not die an anguished death of my own doing. I write to tell my younger self that the sorrows of living are unceasing, but that our capacity to love and to laugh are equally boundless. I write to turn the hourglass upside down. I write to see the faces of ghosts on clouds. I write to create a vital and carnal topography of madness. I write to offer companionship to others going through similar losses. I write to make peace. I write to disturb peace. I write to remind myself that caring for oneself is not self-indulgence. I write to remind myself that life itself is the meaning. I write until my fingers are calloused. I write until my nails are crusted with mud. I write because it is dirty work. I write because I don't know where all the pieces belong. I write knowing that the rational that does not erase the pain. I write to set my insides on fire. I write to rupture and to mend. I write because I want to. I write when I do not want to. I write because I must. I write, I write, I write. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was lovely. It's now my turn. I'm going to introduce Mike and the Unraveling book. I'll introduce Mike first, and then I'll talk about the book. Mike Alvarez is Assistant Professor of Communication at the University of New Hampshire in Durham, USA. He's the author of 2 books, The Paradox of Suicide and Creativity, Lexington Books 2020, and Unraveling, the one we're talking about today, an autoethnography of suicide and renewal, Routledge last year. He's also lead author of A Plague for Our Time, Dying and Death in the Age of COVID-19, McFarland, forthcoming, and lead editor of Suicide and Popular Media and Culture, Bristol University Press and Progress. Dr. Alvarez is a founding member of the National Communication Association's Death and Dying Division. He teaches courses in mental health communication, end-of-life communication, film and media studies, and autoethnography. And now I'm going to introduce his book, and I'm going to do it from my endorsement in the book. This is a marvelous book. I have to say I've got 2 copies. One is full of my marginalia. The other one's a clean copy. I've also, by the way, plug, there's a review of his book. It's going to, from me, is going to be published in the Journal of Autoethnography. I hope it's the next edition. I'm not sure. I think it is. Wonderful book. This is novelistic, evocative autoethnography at its best. It's a gripping, majestic literary and human science achievement in which, with great skill and aplomb, M.F. Alvarez displays the nuances of narrative theory used in its crafting. More than that, Unraveling constitutes a major autoethnographic challenge to reductionist biopsychiatric accounts of human misery, suicide, and recovery renewal. Oh, that's close to my heart. Alvarez has achieved what he set out to do, gifted a book to the world that will help stop the bleeding and set our insides on fire. And over to you, Mike. You were going to read the prologue now.
Sure. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Alec. And, I very much look forward to your review, which I've already read, but I look forward to seeing it in print. But so, yes, at this juncture, I would like to read the prologue to the book. In some context, this is the prologue to the story portion of the book. The book is divided into 2 parts, and I can address that in a moment. And in this prologue, the readers find Mike Alvarez, then a junior in college, on the day that he was admitted to the mental hospital, after he disclosed to his psychiatrist his plans and attempts to end his life. So this book begins right in the middle of unfolding action. And so it begins in media res. And I did this as a way of communicating to readers that the story is told via active versus retrospective narration. So that said, let's begin. As soon as I walked through the sliding doors, I heard a scream. The EMT escorting me from the ambulance didn't seem fazed by it, but I could feel the hair on my arms and neck rise as if electrically charged. The nurse manning the front desk asked me to sit, so I did. She disappeared behind the wood panel door. Minutes later, she reappeared with a white styrofoam tray. "You look hungry," she said, placing the tray on my lap. "Why don't you eat while we get the paperwork started?" I looked at the tray's contents. applesauce, buttered bread, turkey with gravy, chocolate milk. They reminded me of grade school, of childhood simplicity. But when I peeled the plastic wrap, I noticed there was no knife, just a spork, napkin, and straw. The moment I dipped the spork into the applesauce, the piercing scream returned. This time, it didn't stop. There was no mistaking it. The scream belonged to a child. I imagined a boy no older than 8, helpless, pinned to the ground by 2 orderlies, his voice the last remnant of his agency. Terror-stricken by the sight of a needle in gloved hands, the boy would kick and flail and then yelp when needle finally broke skin. I almost lost my appetite. The scream turned into quiet sobs until all I could hear was the compressor churning in the nearby water cooler. The boy must be sedated now, lying in a pool of urine, saliva trickling down his chin. His hands and face, his white t-shirt and trousers would be caked with feces, or so I imagined. The silence was unnerving. I looked in the child's direction, but concrete walls obstructed my view. Powerless, I resumed eating. The applesauce was runny, the turkey dry, and the bread stale, but I wolfed them down all the same. For weeks, I eaten nothing but crackers and soda. The nurse returned with a wooden clipboard. "If you could just sign these when you're ready," she said. I looked over the forms, reading only the bold and italicized letters before signing away my claim to normalcy. The fluorescent lights overhead lost their intensity. The white walls their glow. Even the pervasive smell of hand sanitizer was suddenly neutralized. My perceptions no longer belonged to me. Here, I would be told what I was seeing, thinking, and feeling. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I apologize. I'm sorry for my phone, my main landline going off just there. Sorry.
That's all right. It actually creates punctuations for my reading. It's
wasn't.
perfectly timed. I don't know if you orchestrated it that way, Alec.
No, that was not supposed to happen. Sorry. Okay, now I'm going to ask you some questions about the book in sequence. The first one is your narrative choices and the structure of the book, how that came about. You make some mention of them in the book. You talk reflexively about some of the choices you made, about how to structure the book and some of the narrative styles you use. But I wonder if you can talk more about it, Mike.
Sure. So I'll speak to the structure of the book, and in the process, I'll address some of the narrative choices I've made. And so the book is split into 2 parts. So part 1 is the autoethnographic story itself. And that itself consists of 2 plot threads. So one plot thread, we can call it the A plot, follows Mike Alvarez as a young adult as he slowly loses his grip on so-called reality. He becomes anxious and then paranoid and then suicidal until eventually he attempts suicide and is admitted to a mental hospital. And the rest of that plot sees him attempting to put himself back together and reconnect with the world. So the other plot thread in part 1 follows Mike as a child, as he weathers myriad traumas and abuses. So the story goes back and forth in time between episodes from young adulthood, which I've marked as chapters, and episodes from childhood, which I've marked as interludes. And I do this to show the inseparability of the child self from the adult self, and also to show how mental health and suicide are influenced by past tragedies as much as they are influenced by present circumstances. So in short, that's part one of the book. So part two are the autoethnographic reflections that you've alluded to, Alec. And that part contains three analytical chapters. One chapter speaks to the narrative theories that I used in crafting the autoethnographic story. Another chapter speaks to the limits of medicalized ways of knowing, to basically the shortcomings, and I would say dehumanization perpetuated by the biopsychiatric model and the psychiatric industrial complex. And then the third analytic chapter in part two speaks to the ethical dilemmas that autoethnographers face when we write about ourselves, the people in our life worlds, and the larger social world. So to summarize, part one is the autoethnographic story is told in an in-the-moment narrational style by an active narrator. I do this to create a sense of urgency and immediacy and put readers in the shoes of the character. And then, whereas part two, the autoethnographic reflections, I is told from the point of view of present day Mike Alvarez by a retrospective narrator. It's probably, audience members are probably wondering why I speak about Mike Alvarez in the third person and rather than the same I, but I do this to distinguish between the author, the character, and the narrator. And you do see that in the book as well. I make that distinction. But that's the structure and some of the narrative choices I made in a nutshell in response to your question.
Okay, Mike, thanks so much for that. I want to pick up on what you mentioned about medicalized ways of knowing. I've got some skin in the game here. I've written against the medicalization of so-called mental health for years. And so I wonder if you can talk about your own perspective on demedicalizing mental health and also the schizophrenia concept that you mentioned in the book. Um, um, we've talked about this before, about whether it should be on scare quotes or not.
Yeah, right. I mean, normally when I speak of mental illness, I usually preface it with the word so-called to call attention to
Cool.
the fact that it is at least as much a social construction.
Right.
And although I don't put schizophrenia in scare quotes, but because I really like the Greek roots of the word, like
Mm-hmm.
schizo, mind, or soul, or psyche,
Yeah.
and schizo's porn, split, and phrenia as soul, psyche, even soul, and I don't I put you I when I use mental health diagnoses, I usually preface it with the word so-called or put them in scare quotes. But when it comes to schizophrenia, I don't, but it's because the origins of the word is kind of evocative if it's
Yeah.
disentangled from its biomedical trappings and its torn soul. And that is,
Sure.
the feeling of having one's soul rent asunder. But speaking to the larger project of demedicalizing mental health, I mean, the book Unraveling, and I would say my previous book and much of my writings really pushes against the reduction of so-called mental illness and suicide to the endogenous. And by endogenous, I mean something that can be primarily or exclusively located inside the individual, whether it's a genetic predisposition, neurotransmitter activity gone awry, or a biochemical imbalance. I mean, I want to make clear that I do not discount the role of biology and heredity, but what I do find problematic is the privileged status afforded these at the expense of the material context that produce
Mm-hmm.
history. And by material context, I mean the social, the cultural, the historical, the relational, even political contexts that make life unlivable or not worth living for many
Mm-hmm.
people. So, in Unraveling in much of my work, I advocate for viewing suicide and so-called mental illness as communicative. And by that, I mean so-called mental illness and suicide are communicative of intersubjective catastrophes
Mm-hmm.
that have taken place in a person's life, but they're also communicative of a disordered moral and social order. So instead of shifting the blame and by making attributions of deficits to the person who is so-called mentally ill or suicidal, perhaps we should shift the lens to the moral and social order that they inhabit that produce the very misery that creates suicidality in the first place. So, and with regards to my point of suicide and so-called mental illness as communicative, I think of thoughts, behaviors, and utterances that might seem nonsensical, like the hallucinations, the auditory or visual hallucinations of the so-called schizophrenic, or the psychotic symptomatology exhibited by Mike Alvarez in the book. Those thoughts, behaviors, and utterances, even they may seem nonsensical or strange on the surface, but when placed within their rightful context, their rightful intersubjective contexts, they become meaningful and humanly intelligible.
Absolutely. And you did such a brilliant job of that, Mike. Absolutely, throughout the book, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, I also want to add to that with regards to demedicalizing. You know, in mainstream suicidology, there's a trend of obsessively cataloging risk factors for
Yeah.
suicide. And I want to be clear that I think it is important for us to know what those risk factors are for suicide and how those risk factors are distributed among different communities. So just to take Mike Alvarez in Unraveling as an example, the risk factors are many. They include child abuse and molestation, gay identity, poverty, dislocation, the death of a family member, abandonment by a parent, depression, anxiety, psychosis, perfectionism. The list goes on and on. But the problem is that so much of mainstream suicidology is driven by the search for more and more risk factors and more communities in which to study these risk factors, again, with little consideration for context. You know, a person can exhibit many risk factors for suicide and not die by suicide. Conversely, a person can exhibit few, if any, risk factors and one day, seemingly out of the blue, decide to end their life. So, you know, what accounts for these discrepant outcomes? Well, we need to look at context. But mainstream suicidology treats context as background noise to control for, rather than something to be taken seriously. And of course, we also need to account for suicidal people's own perspectives on suicide. A catalog of risk factors won't tell us that, but personal narratives and autoethnography can. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well said. Here. That's right. People treat context as background noise. And I think risk factors and so-called a lot of suicidology and suicide researchers maintain a very hands-off, sanitized, distance approach to suicide. They don't like to get too close to it, as I found out in my own work. Yeah, fantastic, Mike. So I want to turn now to your concepts of recovery. We've had conversations about this before, haven't we? I prefer the term discovery. So you know, your take on your own recovery journey.
Yeah, so that's a very loaded question. But let me try to parse this out. So there are many aspects of recovery that or at least common sense understandings of recovery that are rooted in the medical model that I push against. So this is quite good. So let me see if I can untangle this one by one. So of course, one notion that my work Unraveling, but also my other writings by extension pushes against is this whole notion of recovery as an outcome. The whole notion that recovery is this discrete milestone that is triumphantly reached by the individual based on their inner reserve or resilience. It's a very neoliberal idea, really, because according to this model, there is a clear endpoint to mental suffering and suicidality. But that model or that conception of recovery as outcome really flies in the face of many suicidal people's lived experience. So, you know, in my study of personal narratives and online communication among suicidal people, which I cite in the reflection chapters of Unraveling, you know, I found time and time again that for many people, suicide, once considered, never ceases to be an option. The door to suicide remains perpetually ajar for many, even when life has turned for the better. And you know, Alec, in your the anthology you co-edited, Our Encounters with Suicide, a lot of contributors can attest to um, suicide being a constant thought, even when
Yeah.
they are in a place in their life that they are joyful. Loretta Lemaster can attest to this as well, and so does Alexandra Barril in their work.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, this finding is striking big for me because it's all too familiar. I mean, even now, I still think about suicide most days, if not every day. But suicidality, the whole idea that recovery is an outcome, d- kind of fails to acknowledge that suicidality can oscillate or coexist with or be punctuated by moments of joy. And it also fails to acknowledge that one can harbor thoughts of suicide without needing to act on them. And suicidal people might also seek refuge in thoughts of death, which can serve as pressure valves that can release pent-up emotions. For me personally, I think about death quite often, and thinking about death and thinking myself dead sometimes paradoxically can act as a coping mechanism when I feel incredibly stressed and under duress. So, in a nutshell, I resist the idea that recovery is an outcome, and I would argue that that model is harmful because what it does, it's that it shames people who may
Yep.
harbor suicidal thoughts, even perhaps after they've undergone years and years of conventional treatment.
Yep.
Shames people as defective or deficient because they don't meet some arbitrary thresholds of normalcy. So, you know, what we think of as recovery, I'd like to think of it as an ongoing process with necessarily an end in sight, not an outcome. But I would like to say that the journey does produce outcomes, plural, that are personally meaningful to the suicidal person. So that's one aspect of the recovery model that's rooted in the biomedical model that I push against. Another aspect that I allude to is the placing the burden of recovery on the individual, exclusively on the individual, that neoliberal model of pulling yourselves up by the bootstraps.
Yep.
You know, we don't get to a better place on our own, whatever that place may be, and that's a place that's decided by the suicidal individual. We don't get to the better place on our own. We come to an acceptance of ourselves and recover lost aspects of ourselves with love, with compassion, with understanding, with the support of others, and with the deferral of their judgment. So I'd like to think of recovery as relational rather than this over individualizing. Another
Yeah.
aspect too is this idea that recovery has to be something so grand and sweeping or monumental. And when I say that, I think about the words of the author, Deanne Ackerman. She wrote a book called A Slender Thread, Rediscovering Hope at the Heart of Crisis. And it's a memoir recounting her experience as a crisis hotline operator. And somewhere in that memoir, she says something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing here, we hang on to life by such humble knots. Sometimes retying one of them is enough. And I really love that sentence because it speaks to the idea of so-called recovery as something that can be found in the everyday, in those quotidian moments that we take for granted. So going back to your discovery, because you say perhaps instead of thinking of recovery, we should be using the word discovery. That really resonates with my use of the word unraveling, which is the title of the book.
Yeah.
When I was trying to come up with a title for the book, I was told that the original title I had wasn't gonna work because it was too metaphoric. It was my book. The title that I'd proposed was originally The Color of Dusk, because the color of dusk is the color of blood when it's diluted by water. And it refers to a very poignant moment in the narrative where Mike Alvarez harms himself for the very first time, and he sees his blood swirling down the drain. But so The Color of Dusk wasn't going to work from a publisher standpoint because it's too vague. But I came up with Unraveling, and I used Unraveling for two reasons. One, it speaks to the phenomenological experience of coming apart at the seams of unraveling. But unraveling is also an invitation to discover. It's an invitation to discover the myriad traumas that lead to breakage. And it also speaks to the myriad possibilities of discovering the possibilities for reconstituting the self in the wake of traumatic loss, of reconstituting the self in connection with others, which I mentioned can be a very lifelong process. But yeah, that's in response to your question, that's my very loaded answer.
Okay, Mike. Yeah, unraveling's a great metaphor. Works really well in the book. The last question, hopefully before you read your final excerpt, is about your writing. The function of the book for you is a therapeutic tool. The Mike Alvarez that was there, that was around before the book and before you started the book, and the Mike Alvarez now, is there to what extent is the Mike Alvarez now different from the Mike Alvarez before? And related to that, to what extent and how, excuse me, did the book, did working on the book function as a therapeutic tool, a therapeutic journey for you?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question, Alec. So writing this book was a years-long journey, and I can speak about the book and its therapeutic role during many junctures of that journey. So when I first embarked on writing the book, especially the story portion, I didn't have therapy or well-being in mind, in part because when I drafted the story portion, it was actually done within the context of a creative writing MFA program. And so what I wanted more than anything else, like many MFA students, was to produce a compelling work of art. So I was very attuned to craft and making something beautiful, despite the pain that it would require of me to revisit some of those memories. But I'm a firm believer that to write one good book, you need to read a lot of good books and pay attention to how they're crafted. And I did exactly that. But the thing is, even though my focus at the time was on craft, in the course of stories, or of reading stories that are similar to mine, so stories of trauma, stories of injustice, stories of marginalization, stories of mental suffering, I felt my own pain and experiences legitimized. So that's one part in which the journey was therapeutic. And the more I wrote, and the less intense and more pliable the emotions associated with those experiences became. So such that, I write about many like intrusive thoughts and psychotic thoughts, for lack of a better word, that Mike experienced in Unraveling. And when I first wrote those, I felt a lot of shame, as if people were looking over my shoulders. But the more I wrote and the more I read narratives that were resonant with mine, the more I felt that shame dissolving into embarrassment. So I think it's writing the story is therapeutic in that I encountered other stories that are similar to mine, which were legitimizing, but which gave me confidence and permission to write my own story, which in turn made those very difficult emotions to wrestle with a lot more pliable and have less hold on me as a person. Another aspect, though, is when I was writing the story portion of my book, in order to finish on time, I adopted a very disciplined and strict writing habit. So I would get up at 6 in the morning, have breakfast, write and revise until 9 a.m., take a break, then write and revise again until 12 noon, and then I'd have lunch, and then write some more and be done by 3 p.m. at the latest. It was um, very disciplined, and I did that for an entire semester. It definitely facilitated the completion of the draft, but it did something else. What it did was that it put a temporal frame around the processing of trauma. It was not the intentional, but that was the consequence of this habit. So when I was done writing, I would, what I did with the rest of my day was up to me, but it cannot be anything related to work. And again, speaking to the frame, putting a temporal frame around trauma, it kept traumatic stuff from spilling uncontrollably into those marginal spaces of my life. So that's part, that's part of the journey. But of course, this book, Unraveling, is not a memoir, but an autoethnography, because at a certain point I had the choice to publish the book either as a memoir or expand it and turn it into an autoethnography. And I will say that I am very pleased with my decision to turn it into an autoethnography, because in doing so, that proved to be therapeutic as well. And I'll say that, and I'll touch upon that shortly. So, when I write the analytical chapters, I revisited and revised my story to make my cultural critiques more apparent. And in doing that, I felt a greater sense of wholeness, because in turning this work from a memoir to an autoethnography, in connecting it with the literature, I was fusing my identities as a social scientist and a creative artist. I was also fusing my identities as a scholar of suicide and a suicide attempt survivor. And in having those two parts, I was putting my younger self in conversation with my present self, which drives home to me how much I have grown as a person. So, and to borrow the words of the late Alice Miller, I also had an enlightened witness by my side in the form of Carolyn Ellis, who worked with me every step of the way in turning the memoir into an autoethnography. So you ask Alex, what is President Mike Alvarez now? I would say that Mike Alvarez, as a result of writing this autoethnographic story and undertaking this writing journey, is someone who is at peace with his turbulent emotions. Although, and also someone for whom these emotions are not nearly as turbulent as they once were. But of course, a reversal of our fortune and circumstance can always turn things around. But I'm at a point in my life, Mike Alvarez is at a point in his life where he is relearning, I should say relearning, to live life a little more spontaneously and more playfully. So yeah, so that's my response. I'm all over the place with these answers. You ask hard-hitting questions, Alex.
That's great to hear, Mike. Thank you. Yeah, and the book is available on Amazon in the UK. Somebody asked that question. Okay, Mike, we've got 12 minutes left. We talked about the option of you reading a bit of your final excerpt, but we need to also leave time for questions. So
sure. Yeah, this excerpt is actually 2 minutes. So once I read it, we will still have 10 minutes for questions.
Okay.
I've timed my excerpts to be exactly 2 to 2.5 minutes each.
Okay.
But so this excerpt I'm going to read is from chapter 7 of the book, which is called which is called Asylum. And this piece finds Mike Alvarez in the mental hospital, forging alliances with his fellow inpatients and turning their private despair into communal laughter. I wanted to end this segment of our panel with something with moments of levity. And with that, let's begin. One afternoon, as we were waiting for group to start, the mole, a staff member who was the target of much contempt, entered the windowless classroom. "Today, we're going to talk about the food pyramid," said the mole, fumbling with a stack of handouts under his arm. To our dismay, he was that afternoon's facilitator. "Again?" exclaimed one of the more seasoned patients, an elderly woman knitting a scarf. I understood her frustration. The day before, we had to listen to the importance of drinking 8 glasses of water per day, which I could never recall doing. "It's important to eat lots of fruits and vegetables," continued the mole, "like spinach, broccoli, mushrooms, and the mushroom isn't a vegetable, Tammy interrupted. It's a fungus. Excuse me? You heard her, said Gertrude. Fungus. 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 I love the way she enunciated each syllable, how her shoulders seesawed up and down, how each letter was accompanied by a snap of her fingers. The word fungus made the mole cringe, as if someone was telling him for the first time that he'd been eating diseased toenails. He shook his head in utter disbelief. No, no, that can't be right. But it certainly is, exclaimed Tammy. Tammy, a biology major, took the painstaking effort to explain what makes the mushroom a fungus. First, mushrooms don't have roots, stems, or leaves. They have filaments, she said. Second, they reproduce through spores, not seeds. And third, they're not green because they don't have chlorophyll. I was impressed with her intelligence and clarity. So were the other patients. But the mole wasn't having it. Well, I don't believe it, he said firmly. He didn't believe it because to him, Tammy was just another madwoman. Someone suffers from delusions of omnipotence, Gertrude said in sing-song. More like impotence, I muttered under my breath. Laughter. I looked at the mole. He looked right back at me. His face had turned puffy and red, like the tomato he'd said was also a vegetable. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Mike. That's fantastic. Okay. Now, is it my job to look for people that want to ask questions, Carol, or is it yours?
You can go ahead if you'd like.
I
or
don't
I'm
mind.
happy- Go ahead. You go ahead.
Shall I do that? Okay,
Yeah.
I'll do that. I'm looking for hands now. Anyone got hands up?
Oh, Keith.
Keith has his hand up.
Is he? Okay, Keith, go for
Hey
it.
there. I'll just get right to it because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions and comments. Brilliant, brilliant work. I wonder if I know you have something to say about the process of writing trauma and the difficulty of that. Yours very ecstatic, right? An ecstatic example of that. But also I think your writing and experiences can help people understand, even introductory writers with autoethnography, about what it's like to write difficult ideas. So I wonder if you have an idea or two about what it was like for you to write through this large, issue, but also how we could distill that and benefit from your writing and practice it ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for that question. And this is also a question that I wrestle with in my autoethnography class because when I tell my autoethnography students, on the one hand, I tell them, I don't mandate the writing of trauma, but in this class, I will not censor it either. So, and I think with in terms of introducing the process of writing trauma, I'm going to relay an advice that I received that ended up being very helpful to me and still continues to be helpful, which is to treat the page as a therapist's office. And basically to write whatever you want to write. Don't censor anything. I mean, I know that when we revise our work for publication or for even for dissemination or sharing with a broader readership, that we may choose to remove things and even, of course, change identities to protect the names of the people we write about. But the initial stage, during that for your eyes only stage, write as if you're the only person in the room. Don't, well, I was going to say don't hold back, but well, we also have to afford our psyche respect. So if something is too painful and that it causes us harm, then perhaps we should rethink our our willingness to go into such psychologically dangerous terrain. But I do think that just writing in in a less inhibited manner really does for our writing, because we can more honest with ourselves, and at the same time, because when we censor ourselves from the beginning, that can really stifle the story from emerging. I also don't write things in order. I write things as fragments. When I wrote Unraveling, I wrote things that some days I might write about things that are comfortable for me. Sometimes I might test the waters and write about things that are not so comfortable, and I might put it aside for the time being if it gets to be too much, and then move on to something else. And what that allows me to do is just to create these islands of thoughts and emotions that eventually form bridges between them. And some of those bridges might be tenuous, but over time they become stronger, and that becomes the basis of the story. Eventually, I like the idea of trust the process when it comes to writing, and to just write in the order, basically write with my gut, but revise with my head. That's the principle that I abide by. And I just let my intuition guide me to where I want to write, to what I want to write about next. And eventually I trust that a form will come. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you for the gifts that are this discussion in your book. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah.
So Alec, if I can add here a little bit, I notice in the chat there are a lot of interesting comments, and Alexandra, you made one, and let's get Mike to respond to that. But there are also other people who would like to hear your response. I don't want to put you on the spot, but anything that you would like to say in response to Mike's work. But the comment was, I wonder how your students react to those autoethnographic aspects of your book.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, Alexandra, I want to thank you as well. I've also recently discovered your work. Well, I discovered your 2020 essay. Was it 2020, your suicidism essay last year? And I managed to read it and cite it in time. So I know I cite it in Unraveling, but I recently got a copy of your book and I am working through it. So with regards to my students' reactions to my book, well, I actually assigned this book. I was very nervous about doing this. And to be honest, it's not even about the things about mental health and suicide that I was really nervous about. It's other things that I thought might be a little too much, like Mike's fantasies of sex or those things. But I assigned it to my students anyway. But I will say this, even though this is I'm teaching autoethnography now, and it's my first time using this book for pedagogical reason, but I have used excerpts of it in the past for courses like end-of-life communication and mental health communication. And I do this in a way because I want to give my students permission. Again, I don't mandate the sharing of difficult stories, but if I'm teaching a class that will delve into difficult material, I want to give my students permission to be able to disclose things about themselves without mandating it. Also, in autoethnography, I have told my students this, and it's also a principle I abide by. I will never ask things of my students, things that I myself am not willing to do. So if I'm going to, in an autoethnography class, if I'm going to make them write a story, and the story can be of anything they choose, it doesn't have to be traumatic, but if I'm going to ask them to share stories about themselves and connect it with the world around them, I should be doing the same thing. And with regards to the responses, in some ways, my students have expressed appreciation for, I guess, one thing, that I am a human to them, that I am willing to be human and not just a sage on stage or a professor that is several years removed from them, that I am this living human being. And they also have expressed appreciation for being able to confide things in me. Of course, like Alexander, like you said, like these testimonials can also be very, very, and like last semester, I taught mental health communication and end-of-life communication in the same semester. And that was a very difficult semester for me because I had students who were wrestling with mental health struggles. And then, of course, I refer there. I had to do a lot of checking in and also referral if that was necessary. But then there was also my students who were wrestling with grief of various forms. But yeah, so I encountered similar difficulties that you spoke with in your presentation about there are positive aspects of, because in disclosing we give others permission to disclose, which can be really it can really make the teacher-student relationship so rewarding, but it comes with challenges of testing the limits of what I am capable of shouldering. There are, so, but yes, I don't know if I've answered your question in a satisfactory way, but these are the thoughts that are running through my head as I read your comment and when Carolyn read your comment again. Thank you.
Okay, it's 16:50 now. I don't know, do we have to wind up absolutely on time?
Yes.
All right, okay.
No, no,
think
no,
so.
you can,
Well,
you can go a few more minutes. Don't listen to Art.
no, I mean, he can go right up to 58.
Right. Oh,
All right, well, I've just been looking at the comments. Art posed a really good question. There's loads of good questions there, but early on, Mike, would you talk a bit more? Well, you can ask yourself, Art.
Well, would you talk a bit more about your repetitive use of the term so-called mental illness? Seems to me if this term were to take hold, it might become just another, though preferable classification, what the philosopher Ian Hacking called a kind of person, and so comes to experience himself herself in that way. I don't know what it would mean to a person to refer to themselves as so-called mentally ill, but I know you had a very intentional use of this term, somewhat like Zaz's idea of the myth of mental illness. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And in some ways, I love that question because it brings us back to the very title of the book. Because like I thought about what term would honor the experiential dimension of losing one's grip on so-called, reality. But madness, I mean, madness is a powerful word, and there's the mad pride movement that has reclaimed the word mad as a point of pride rather than shame. But madness speaks to the phenomenological experience of descending, but not quite, you know, go like ascending. So I thought, and mental illness is a word that because of its biological trappings, biomedical trappings, even if you flavor it with so-called, it still doesn't quite get away from that. And in some ways, that's where the book, the title actually emerges, Unraveling. Well, I thought about, well, how can I capture the phenomenological experience of coming up at the seams in a way that welcomes different forms of breaking down it, whether it be obsessions, compulsions, delusions, psychotic states, disordered eating. What word can I use to capture the difficulty and the soul-wrenching experience of those? And I thought, well, unraveling is a good word. Although it's still, in terms of like word usage, I'm still thinking about how that word will come into use. Like, if we substitute unraveling for mental illness, how would that look like? Well, I can't really answer that question right now, but the word came to me, like unraveling. It's a word that really does, I think, honor to the experiential dimension of so-called madness, but it's descriptive, but it's also invites action. Like, let's unravel why this came to be in the first place. Let's unravel the meaning behind the delusion or the hallucination or the intrusive thoughts. Let's unravel the context that produce these things. So the unraveling ended up for the time being is my tentative not solution, but
It's okay. Yeah.
yeah, replacement for the word, but but again, it has yet to be seen how
Okay.
how much momentum that word gains.
Okay.
Yeah.
I noticed Natasha has her hand up. Okay, Natasha.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just thinking when you were speaking about unraveling, and for me, it connotes more of a healing kind of process of unraveling from, the context and the complexities and the things that you know, often people don't see when you're going through any kind of emotional distress, especially if those distresses are more, and I'm not comparing, I'm talking really broadly, but especially when those experiences are so invisible to other people. So I just like that term. I was wondering if there's a couple things, and we won't have time to talk about all of them. I'm curious about that distinction or the switch you made from memoir to autoethnography, but I don't think that might not be of interest to everybody. I'm wondering if there's the transcultural psychiatry unit at McGill has been ongoing for many years. Are you aware of them? Because I just think that, have you presented your work there at all?
I have not, but I am aware of them. And
Yeah, I
have
just
not-
think that would be a great place to share your work. Yeah, it's a wonderful community. And then I guess just a side thought, and this is just something, well, I think I've been thinking about mental health in the context of children. And one of my big beefs is, and this ties into sort of broadly, you know, what some people call the neurodiversity movement, or there's, you know, I think of neurodiversity in different ways, but there's a narrative there too. There are narratives, probably multiple narratives. And I just think about the construction of how we think about these things. And I really push it. I don't want to be reductive to the brain, I guess is what I'm saying from my perspective. But I do wonder about, yeah, the context of children and the role. I think there's a role here of education too. And a lot of us are talking about higher ed, but we often forget that childhood context. And what I see in the school systems, at least where I'm located, K to 12, and, you know, there are a lot of parents talking about the explosion of mental illness in children and youth, particularly since COVID and ongoing, and just the pathologization of the real normal distresses, and that kids in the school system, I mean, and I'm actually in a very sort of progressive school system where my child is, but getting access to the kinds of things they need, especially for kids who are you know, whatever the labels are, neurodivergent, gifted. There's a whole rising discourse around giftedness again. And this is something that's really interesting to me in terms of how we understand children, how we understand, and kids that have different, like this assumption that kids are just, you know, the thoughts about children being vessels and all of that, and cramming things in. But then what do we do with those kids who are, you know, highly intelligent or highly sensitive? And there's and there's so many different ways of talking about this. And I don't want to, you know, exclude one or the other or say one's better than the other, but I think it's so complex. And I think it is so important and I know people are starting to talk about this in terms of mental health, but there's just such a lack of real understanding, I think, out there when you get into it on the ground. So anyway,
So we should probably,
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. Yeah.
sorry.
yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, but we should probably end because it's 1 minute till the next session. So
Yeah.
give them a chance to get started. But thank you, Alec. Thank you, Mike. Just wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.